Hi, my name is Brett Statham. In this short video, I'd like to show you how to prepare your Windows 8 Release Preview workstation for development with Visual Studio 2010 and the Azure SDK. I'll also show you the installation of the Visual Studio 2012 Express for Windows 8 release candidate. You'll notice I already have Windows 8 Preview Release installed. If I go to my desktop though and open up the web browser, if you didn't already have the Windows 8 Release Preview, you could go to preview.windows.com and then follow the instructions there for downloading and installing it. I've already got it though. So I'm actually going to use an older document that explains how to use the Windows Azure SDK with Visual Studio 2010 and the Visual Studio 11 beta on Windows 8. And you'll find that the steps are actually pretty much identical, and I'll just mention a few additional things at the end here though. But this document here explains both how to install on Windows 7 as well as how to install on Windows 8 Consumer Preview or the CP release. So of course here I'll be doing it on the Release Preview or RP. But if I scroll down here, I can see that there's actually a number of steps that I need to go through to prepare the operating system so that the Windows Azure SDK will function properly here. So there's a number of Windows features that I need to turn on or off. So let me go back to my start screen, and I'm just going to start typing Windows Features. And in the search bar that pops up here, under Settings, I can see Turn Windows Features on or off. And I get basically a window here that looks pretty much identical to what we see showing up over there on the right-hand side is that list, right? But now actually following the worded list will be a little bit simpler for me here. So I'm going to go in and just turn on the features that are requested here. So first it tells me that underneath .NET 3 Framework 3.5 I need to enable Windows Communication Foundation HTTP activation, and then a similar feature for WCF services on .NET 4.5. Then I can see that actually a number of these other features are already enabled, like ASP.NET 4.5 and TCP port sharing. So you just want to verify that they're on. If they weren't already, then enable them. Underneath Internet Information Services, I want to come down to Web Management Tools and turn on the IIS Management Console. And then underneath World Wide Web Services, I want to go ahead and expand Application Development Features and verify that the .NET 3.5 and 4.5 frameworks are installed. Notice ASP.NET 4.5 is already on, but I need to turn on ASP.NET 3.5. And then make sure that the ISAPI extensions and filters are enabled. And then for common HTTP features, I want to turn them all on except the last one, which is WebDev. Now, you could certainly turn on other features. These are just the ones that you want to make sure that you have on for the Windows Azure SDK and the emulators to function properly on your development workstations. Lastly, underneath Health and Diagnostics, I want to make sure to turn on the logging tools as well as Request Monitor and Tracing. And underneath Security, I want to turn on or ensure that Request Filtering is on. I can see it already was. So good. So I've selected all the appropriate features. When I say OK, then I'll see that Windows Features goes out and looks for the files that it needs. It actually locates some that it has to download from Windows Update. So quick comment as I go through this video, periodically I'll hit parts of the demo that take a long time, and I'll just pause the recording during those so you don't have to sit and watch the progress bar, go across the screen here. But let me go ahead and let it start downloading files from Windows Update. So that took about a minute and a half to complete. Let it continue and apply the changes. Alright, so that took about another minute. But at this point then, all the appropriate Windows features have been turned on. So I'm going to return back to this post on installing Windows Azure SDK. Another quick side comment, I'll provide you a list of all the links here at the end, as well as in a blog post that's associated with this video here. But so now that we've turned on all the appropriate Windows features, the next thing it wants me to do is go to install the Windows Server 2008 R2 Express with Service Pack 1. And if I actually follow that link, what I really want to do is install one of these versions that's appropriate for the bitness of my Windows 8 machine. So there's 64 and x86 or 64 and 32-bit versions. You could install just Express by itself, and that would certainly be fine. But if you get the version that says WT, that's with tools, and that'll include the management tools, SQL Server Management Studio. There's also an advanced version that includes not only the management tools, but also reporting services, full text search, and some other features out there as well. I'm going to go ahead and just use the version that has the SQL Server Management Studio lightweight version, but you'll notice that that's a 330 megabyte download or so. So rather than making you sit and watch that happen, I've already got those downloaded and copied locally here on my workstation, and here's the executable. So I'll go ahead and kick that exe off. Confirm the user account control prompt. And when the SQL Server Installation Center opens up, I want to click on New Installation or Add Features to an existing installation. We'll be doing a new installation. Accept a license agreement, continue. And on the feature selection page, I'm going to accept all the defaults, but notice that because I downloaded the version with tools, I have the management tools, or at least a basic version of them. So that's good. I'm going to leave the default directories and just click Next. When it comes to ask me for my instance name, SQL Express installations assume an instance name of SQL Express. And you want to leave it as that unless you have a good reason to change it, like if you're installing multiple versions of SQL Express or something like that. But specifically, the Windows Azure SDK storage emulator expects that the SQL instance that it hits is called SQL Express. Now, you could use another one or even a full version of SQL Server if you wanted to, but it would require a custom configuration of the storage emulator using the ds-init command line tool, and I'll actually mention that at the end of this demo here. But point is, unless you have a good reason to change it, leave the instance name and instance ID as SQL Express. So I'll do that and just hit Next. I'm going to leave the default configuration of the security for my service accounts as well as the default settings for the collation. I'm not going to change those. And on the database engine configuration page, under account provisioning, I see that it's defaulting to Windows Authentication mode. That's perfectly fine for the Azure SDK, so I'm going to leave it at that. And I can see that it's already granted my current Windows user account SQL Server Administrator right membership in there. So it's basically my user Windows account is going to be a SQL admin. This is a good time, however, to add other Windows accounts from your local machine or from your domain if need be, that you also want to have be administrative over the SQL Server instance. So I commonly just come in and click on Add, and I'm going to go ahead and add in the entire local administrators group. And that'll let any user account that's on this computer who is a Windows administrator have access to the SQL Server instance with administrative privilege. You could add other specific users if you want to. I'm also going to leave the default paths for all the data directories, and FileStream is a feature of SQL Server that allows us to store binary data out in the actual Windows file system. And you'll need to turn that on if you expect to be using the AdventureWorks sample databases on the SQL Express instance, but we don't need it for the Azure SDK. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that all off at the default settings. So the only thing I really changed on this was adding administrators in as being SQL Server admins. Didn't change the directories and left FileStream alone. So I'll go ahead and hit Next. I'm going to ignore any settings on the error reporting page. Great. Once that installation is complete, we can go ahead and hit the close button. So that actual install took me probably just a little over 10 minutes or so. But I'll close out of the SQL Server Installation Center and return back to the documentation on going through this install here. So I've now completed step 4 here, which is to install SQL Server 2000 R2 Express. The next thing I should do then is actually install Visual Studio. Now I could either install a full version of Visual Studio 2010 with Service Pack 1, or if I prefer, I could just do Visual Web Developer 2010 SP1. If you want to be doing Azure development with one of the Express releases of Visual Studio, it's only the Visual Web Developer Edition that allows you to do Azure development. To keep this as publicly consumable as possible, I'll go ahead and do an install of the Web Developer version. But again, at this point, go do a full install of Visual Studio. Just make sure to get the Service Pack 1 applied as well, if you prefer. I've got a link for that download up here. So again, all these links will be provided to you here at the end as well as in a blog post. But I could go download and install that right now as I wanted to. Or if you prefer, you could find an ISO and download it. An ISO with all of the Express editions on it. I'm going to go ahead and just click on Install Now. And that's actually going to use the web platform installer to go out and install this for me. So I'll just hit install now and let it go through the process. Do my confirmations. Now I'm going to accept the default options here and just hit install. And before I download, notice this is going to be a 325 megabyte download. So again, this is going to take a little bit of time to go through this process. I'll go ahead and hit accept, and then as I need to, I'll pause the video. For any prompts that appear, I'm just going to answer in the affirmative. All right. Now that installation actually took probably 20 minutes overall, maybe slightly longer. And steps 2, 3, and 4 were the longest running. Some of them taking up to close to 10 minutes or so each. So as you go through this on your own workstation, just be aware that some of those steps are going to take some time. Let me go ahead and finish up. And I'm done with the web platform installer here. And now I've got Visual Studio 2010 Web Developer Express installed here. So let me go back to my prompt. Oh, actually, it looks like I moved off my posts. Let me go back to it. So we've done the SQL Express. We've now installed Visual Studio 2010 SP1. If we had any previous Windows Azure SDKs installed, we want to remove those. But this is a clean machine, and I don't have that. And unfortunately, although we were able to use the web platform installer to install Visual Web Developer, we can't use the all-in-one platform installer for the Windows Azure SDK. We need to go download the components individually for the appropriate bitness. And we can get those from the Download Center page off of the Windows Azure website. Again, I've got a quick link for that right here. And you'll notice that we've got downloads for both 64 and 32-bit versions. So grab all 4 files for the appropriate bitness. You'll get the emulator, the libraries for .NET, the SDK, and then the Windows Azure tools for Visual Studio. And that one, there's only one version of it, not a 64 and a 32. But make sure you get the right versions for your bitness. Again, I've already got those downloaded and installed over here. But you do need to make sure to install them in the appropriate order. And that's outlined for you back in this blog post. So we want to install the emulator, then the SDK, then the libraries for .NET, and then the Azure tools for Visual Studio. So emulator, SDK, libraries, tools. So let's install the emulator first. And install. Pretty quick. The SDK. Again, accept and install. Then the libraries for .NET. And then finally, the Visual Studio tools. Okay. So at this point, we should actually be ready to use Visual Studio 2010 or Visual Web Developer for any cloud development, just like we would have back on a Windows 7 workstation or anything else. Of course, if you're planning on doing any specific Windows 8 development, like getting into Metro-style application development or that kind of stuff, then you'll also want to install the latest beta of Visual Studio. Now, at the time this post was written here, that was Visual Studio 11. But with the Windows 8 release preview, we also got a release candidate for Visual Studio 2012 RC. So I'm going to go ahead and jump up there and really quick run through that install. Come down, and again, I'm going to go ahead and just follow the links for the web installer to kick off the Visual Studio 2012 RC for Windows 8. And again, just answer in the affirmative. I will mention, as this starts off, there is also a full version of Visual Studio 2012 that you can download if you prefer to. But I'm going to stick with the Express for Windows 8 edition right now. Okay, and that one's significantly faster than the Visual Studio Web Developer version did for 2010, but it looks like that completed successfully. You know, it allows me to launch it from right here, but I don't actually want to do that yet. At this point, I've actually completed all of the steps outlined in the document that we've been sort of following, right? So we got down here to the end and installed Visual Studio 2012 RC, just not Visual Studio 11 Beta, that's all. A couple other quick things here, though. You'll actually probably find that as soon as you get into Visual Studio 2010 and try to create some cloud projects, that you'll get a warning about needing the NuGet extension manager. So I'm going to go ahead and install that now. can just download that and run it. Confirm the user account control prompt. And you'll notice that in this Visual Studio extension installer here, that it actually discovered that I have both Visual Studio Web Developer Express 2010 as well as Visual Studio Express 2012 RC for Windows 8. So that's good. It actually sees them both, and it'll plug into both of those there. So I'll hit install. And we've got them in there. The last thing that I'll mention here is, as we went through that SQL Server 2008 R2 Express install, I mentioned the SQL Express instance name and said that if need be, you could use a full version of SQL Server or point your storage emulator to a instance named something other than SQL Express. And once you've installed the command line tools, or sorry, the emulator tools, in your program files directory, underneath Windows Azure Emulator, there's an emulator subfolder. Underneath there is a dev store subfolder, and in there you'll see there's this tool called ds-init. Now that's actually a command line tool that you'd want to run, and the instructions for using that are going to be in another link that I'll provide here. But basically you can come in here and use this ds-init command line tool and point it off to either the name of the SQL instance if it's something other than SQL Express, or to the local default instance if you have just a regular version of SQL Server installed as a default instance. So you can use the documentation here to properly configure your Windows Azure Storage emulator. But with that, we should now have a fully configured workstation. So I'm actually going to close out of my browser here. And as if I return back to the Start menu, now move your mouse all the way down into the bottom left-hand corner, and you'll get the Windows 8 Start menu shortcut there. Or you can just hit the Windows key on the keyboard. Either one of those will get you back to the Windows 8 Start menu. And as I scroll over here now, as I've been installing, you'll see now that I have shortcuts here on my Start menu for the VS Express for Windows 8. That's the Visual Studio 2012 RC. But I also have a shortcut over here for the Microsoft Visual Web Developer 2010 Express. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, but I want to run it as administrator. So I've right-clicked on it. If you're on a touch device, you can swipe down on that tile, and in the app bar that pops up, I get Run as Administrator. And I need to do that because the Windows Azure emulator needs to run as administrator. So I'll go ahead and confirm that. Notice it switches me back to the Windows desktop and goes and runs Visual Web Developer Express for the first time. And as I go into my File menu, down to New Project, under Cloud, I should have Windows Azure Project, and I'll go ahead and just create a quick sample Windows Azure project. Pick the default template and say OK. I'm going to go ahead and install from Visual C# and ASP.NET WebRoll into this solution. I'm not going to worry about renaming things, just want to verify functionality. So the solution is loaded up, and let's go ahead and try debugging it. I should see my storage and compute emulators get started. Now this is the first time the storage emulator is run, so this is where it goes in and makes the reservations for the RESTful services that it implements. I'll also open up any firewall ports that are requested here, so I'll allow access to that, and just verify my storage emulator's initialization, and also I can see here that it has created the development storage database, and that'll be off on my SQL Express instance. If you hadn't properly configured ds-init, as I mentioned here, you'd get some errors in here, but this all looks good, so I can say OK. Storage emulator's done, and then it starts up my compute emulator. Alright, and it looks like everything's working. Down on my system tray now, then I do have the icon for my compute and storage emulators, and I can view their UIs, shut them down, etc., just as I would have back on a normal Windows 7 development workstation. So once you get the tools all properly configured, the Visual Studio experience is identical to what it would have been back on Windows 7. I do now, however, also have Visual Studio 2012 RC Express for Windows 8. And just to really quick show you that, I can right click on that. I could pin this back to my taskbar on the desktop if I wanted to. This one I actually don't need to run as administrator though, so I can really just click on the tile to run it. And on the first load here, I can see that it's prompting me to get a developer license for Windows 8 here. So I'm going to go ahead and say agree and run this tool. and I need to sign in with a Windows Live ID. Looks like that succeeded. And now I'm ready to start using Express 2012 RC for Windows 8. Notice under my new project, I don't have cloud projects, but I do have the ability now to create both JavaScript Metro style apps as well as C# XAML style Metro apps, as well as even C++ or VB. So looks like I'm good to go and start doing my Windows 8 development here alongside continuing my standard Azure development using Visual Studio 2010. I'd like to actually mention one last thing. If I open up my browser and go to windows8.codeplex.com, you'll see there is actually a Windows Azure Toolkit for Windows 8. It has special project templates for creating Azure applications that integrate with Metro-style applications. You'll find that at this time, it doesn't work with the Visual Studio 2012 RC, so you want to maybe watch this project here for upcoming updates for when it's functional with Visual Studio 2012 RC. Lastly then, let me go ahead and open up a list of links here. And in fact, I should add that in. Post that link in there as well. Cool. So the links for all the different pages that I went through to get to the downloads, etc., are listed here, and they're actually listed in the order that I discussed them. So you can grab that. I'll also have a blog post related to that on my blog at brettstatham.com, so you can come look for that, and all these links as well as a copy of this video will be available there.